I wonder how you could be so confident to attribute this sort of horror to capitalism specifically.
Well, I mean, China is a very capitalist place, right? I don't think that their economic model is reflective of communism, and I don't think that we have had such an example.
Welcome to the Cogitate podcast. In this episode, I speak with Samah Seger and Chris Huriwai. Chris and Samah are activists and the creators of their own decolonial movement by the name of Aotearoa Liberation League. A large part of their activism is for the better treatment of animals, but they take a holistic approach and therefore comment on many topics. I was happy to get to speak with them because we share some very important moral views and also disagree on many others. I hope you'll find the following dialectic as interesting as I did. We talk about veganism, activism, the documentary film Milked, cultivated meat, capitalism versus communism and other socio-economic systems, private property ownership, pest control, and other topics. One small disclaimer, there was a slight delay when recording this, which made it harder for us to interject every time we might have wanted to. I think a few points get ignored because of this in order to stay on track, but I've cut down the delays for a fluid listening experience. Anyway, now I bring you Chris and Samah. I am speaking with Chris Huriwai and Samah Seger. Chris, Samah, thanks for coming to talk to me today.
Thank you for having us. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Harry. Thanks for having us.
Awesome. So I will have introduced you briefly, but if do you want to give me a elevator summary of what you guys do and how you see yourselves in the public space?
Sure. So our kaupapa is called Aotearoa Liberation League, and essentially what we call ourselves a decolonial animal justice project. And so we're animal rights activists, but we try and look at other movements, to learn from other movements, to strengthen our own movement, and also so that we can contribute to theirs. But on top of it all, putting a decolonial perspective to our activism. And at the moment, I suppose our main tool that we're using is social media, talking about relevant issues, not just to animal rights, but to decolonialism, but to a range of things happening in society at the moment, and to try and kind of simplify them, condense them into short videos, into shareable content that people can, share within their circles.
Yeah, I've seen you've had a lot of success on TikTok. Am I right in assuming that?
Yeah. I mean,
when I searched you up, TikTok was the top hit.
Yeah, TikTok and Instagram. I guess those are the two platforms where short videos, reels, are really taking off, especially, for TikTok. I find TikTok to be really a fascinating space. I find there are a lot of Māori on TikTok. And, before TikTok became TikTok, I think it was called Musical.ly or something along those lines. And it was an app that was designed around singing and dancing. And, for Māori, we really love our performing arts, particularly waiata and kapaka and dancing and whatnot. And so a lot of Māori have congregated into that space. And so, political engagement among Māori is relatively low. And it's really hard to engage certain demographics on a lot of these quite complex issues. So the fact that we have taken off on TikTok and been able to connect with this core demographic that we're hoping to empower and contribute to has been really amazing. I was really wary of joining TikTok. It's just like another social media platform, pain in the ass. But luckily, it's been able to provide a really good space for us.
Yeah. I tried it briefly and it wasn't for me. I've abandoned it mostly. That's how I first heard about you guys is when I was looking into doing some activism or participating in activism. And I joined the Wellington Vegan Actions group and they shared a video of yours. I think it was your very first YouTube video. And I thought, all right, I'll follow these guys, vegans, New Zealand, great, fantastic. And I've been a follower ever since. So I'm pleased to be talking to you. And that's a huge reason why I want to talk to you is because that we have this very significant common ground of the vegan belief or conclusion, whatever you want to call it. And then you also talk about a lot of things that I don't typically look at, and having that on my social media feed is always interesting to have it brought back into my awareness. So it'll be fun to talk about some of these things that I don't normally investigate or tenuously understand. So I guess one thing I always ask, or I'm always interested when I meet other vegans, is what specifically was it that convinced you to go vegan, if you remember?
So I remember some specific milestones, but I think for everyone, there's probably a long history of small little seeds that are planted over time. And, for some people, there is this big moment, and then for me, it was, because I can take it back to those earlier, like what I think were the seeds, which is kind of being raised with the idea of like critical thinking and questioning things, and also understanding politics and injustice. I think that sort of set the ground for me to become vegan later. But the specific kind of moments that I can pinpoint, there are some. I moved into a vegetarian flat when I was studying, and I just asked one of the flatmates, like, "Hey, so why are you vegetarian?" And they just said, "I'm vegetarian because I don't think there's a difference between a cow and a dog, and I wouldn't want to put a dog through a slaughterhouse." And that was a massive light bulb moment for me. I was like, yeah, true. I don't really have a rational argument against that. And so I was pretty much convinced from that moment that I didn't want to eat kind of slaughterhouse animals. But then there was still like quite a few phases to work through. There was the home kill animals that I ate for a while. And there was, of course, the eggs and the dairy. And the final moment for me was driving home from Auckland to Wellington and seeing a farmer take a calf away from a dairy cow. And I saw the cow chasing after her child and crying. And I just sort of pulled over and had a think. And I was like, I just saw a man steal a mother's baby. And the mother was crying. That's really not okay. I'm not okay with that. And I decided I couldn't support the industry anymore.
For me, those small seeds were, I'm the youngest in my whānau, and it was always the youngest's job to look after animals. We had a lot of animals, so in the morning I'd wake up and I'd feed the chickens, and I'd let some of the animals out of their paddocks and whatnot. And I was homeschooled, so from a very early age, being responsible for animals was a big part of my life. But then later on, the more, that milestone that tips you over the edge is I watched the documentary Earthlings. I know a lot of vegans, their vegan journey has started with that documentary. It's quite an old one now, and for people who are interested in looking it up, just brace yourself. I remember I found it because it was described as the scariest documentary on the internet. That was one of the catchphrases that they were using to sell the documentary. And essentially, it goes through essentially of the time, all of the ways that we use and abuse animals. It covered the pet industry, it covered clothing, animal testing, animals in entertainment, and of course, animals in food. And it was actually the second time I watched the documentary. It didn't get me the first time because I was already a vegetarian when I watched it the first time. And then I had that attitude of, well, I'm a vegetarian, I'm doing essentially better than most people. So why should I, as an individual, take that second step? But fast forward a few years in my life, and I guess I kind of grew up a little bit, and I liked the aspect of being vegetarian, and I was in a stage of personal growth, I suppose, reflecting on those aspects that I liked about myself, vegetarianism, and I wanted to take it a step further. So yeah, on reflection and rewatching of that film, it re-cemented the fact, the idea that I didn't want to be associated at all with contributing to what I was seeing in this film.
Yeah, those movies can be quite harrowing. I haven't actually seen Earthlings, but I did watch Cowspiracy right before going vegan, and that
very different.
That helped.
Two very different films.
Are they different?
I think that they did really, really well in Cowspiracy to essentially just talk about facts and to keep that more. People put up their walls, and we all feel really guilty when we reflect on animal agriculture because we're all complicit within it. And so in Cowspiracy, they really tried their best to make it as watchable as possible. So yeah, two very different films, but of course, different strokes for different folks. So I think they're both essential.
Yeah, I don't know if I will watch it because it would be preaching to the choir and it would be uncomfortable.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, people who agree with the lifestyle, I would not put yourself through that extra trauma. I mean, it's just not worth it.
You actually, I wanted to plug Milked, which is a Cowspiracy-esque documentary that you had a significant role in, being the I guess the host or the star of the documentary, if stars can be in documentaries. So firstly, I want to say I watched the film. I went to one of the screenings, and I think what I said to you there was tragic that it's necessary but excellently done, or something like that. And it is a very well made documentary. So I commend you on that, and I want to thank you for making it available online for free, so people listening can watch the Milked film on the Plant-Based News YouTube channel. Is that right?
Ooh, it's actually been moved off of YouTube because our director, Amy Taylor, she's exploring other licensing options, but it is still available for free on Waterbear.
Okay.
You can sign up for free. It's a little bit of a pain having to go through an additional registration. I loved the aspect of having it on YouTube, just being completely freely, widely available on a more well-known platform as well. But Waterbear is a great platform, and completely free still, but yeah, just that extra step people have to go through to get there.
Oh, well, I'll put a link to that in the description of this, wherever it's uploaded, so people can watch it. It is based on the New Zealand dairy industry, but that's appropriate because we're held up as one of the gold standards of dairying globally, and it's pretty appalling what we do down here. So yeah, well done on the documentary.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah.
I was lucky to be working with Amy on this as a co-producer, and yeah, it is very Cowspiracy-esque. A lot of our inspiration for the film came from Cowspiracy, and Keegan Kuhn, director of Cowspiracy, is an executive producer of Milked. So he worked on all the music for the film and gave us a lot of creative advice as well. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of the flavor in there.
The one thing that when I was watching the film, I hoped you would mention, and I was pleased that you did, was cultivated meat and dairy alternatives. Because I think that's going to be a silver bullet in terms of solving, and not completely, but many of the animal welfare issues, climate issues, and even some health issues that come from agriculture. So I wanted to ask you if you guys support cultivated meat, and if you would go so far as to even eat it or consume it.
I don't know if I would consume it. I don't have a particular moral stance against consuming it. But yeah, that one's is a tough one. Would I consume it in the future? I don't know. But in terms of my feelings towards cultivated foods, it seems inevitable, doesn't it, that that's the direction we're heading in. It will be simply a matter of necessity for these industries to pivot because they're running out of resources, right? Even just water, even the most basic of resources required to make the products we currently consume, they're running out. So for these industries to remain relevant, they're going to have to find another way to create these products. Do I think it's the right direction for us to be heading in? No, because I think people should return closer to the land, and I don't think we should all just live in little apartment boxes and get our food from boxes and just be completely disconnected from nature. I'd rather see the opposite happen, which is, these currently the farms that we have are used to create human and forest and ecosystem communities. and people are actually more involved in the growing of food, because we know that when people are connected to the land, that they feel better as well, that they treat each other better, they treat the environment better. There's a lot of benefits to that direct connection with the soil, with plants, with your own food. And yeah, basically, I don't think the billionaires pushing cultivated food are really the ones who are going to give us the big radical solution that we need. But it may be a stepping stone, just, even if it's just buying us some time so we don't completely destroy our environment while we work towards the vision. So yeah, I can see it as a sort of stepping stone, but I don't think it's, where we should be heading. And it's not what I would be pushing for with my activism.
It's a big topic, and I'm glad we're talking about this with someone who is vegan, yeah, it's clear that, well, from my perspective, these products have been created to continue the customer base of particular products that exist today. Like, the McDonald's and the Fonterras and big groups like this, they currently have a product and a distribution system that works really well, but the thing that they are selling is essentially a finite resource, and it's losing its social license, and it's simply not sustainable. So they're just moving on to the next logical thing to sustain their customer base with a product that they know sells. But like everything that Samah has said, it's moving us away from nature. I'd prefer that we just focused on plant-based foods, but that's really not the flavor, I suppose, for a lot of people. A lot of people are scared of change, and they want the exact thing that they're familiar with. I don't like talking about precision fermentation and lab-based meat as a panacea, because then we're saying that these foods are like perfect foods or ideal foods. I mean, we are creating an exact replica of these foods. We are replicating the protein in dairy that we know is carcinogenic. We're replicating, animal-based carcinogens and animal-based nutrients that we know are negative for our health. So, is it the ultimate? No, I don't think so. But, it's a really difficult ethical consideration. Am I going to stand in the way of this technology progressing, knowing that this technology could have such a profound benefit to animals and removing them from this incredibly violent system? I don't know. It depends on how we move in terms of the next 10 years. I think this thing is inevitable. Am I going to get in the way of that? It depends. It depends how likely we are to move into better alternatives when the time comes. But yeah, precision fermentation of dairy products is a little bit different to lab-based meat. Lab-based meat, we know that technology came about through the use of fetal bovine serum, which is, the blood that is taken out of the fetus of a dairy cow. A pregnant dairy cow that has been taken to the slaughterhouse, and we've taken the fetal blood, and that blood is used in all sorts of pharmaceuticals, the creation of vaccines and things like that. And so, it's a real nightmare aspect of animal testing and the use of animal products that is the foundation of lab-based meat. And so it's we're potentially creating something quite fantastic, but the way that we got there kind of reminds me of Hitler in terms of how he progressed the world of medicine by actually using humans to test medication rather than something less accurate like an animal-based model. So we're using these really kind of unethical things to get, does it justify? Is there that justification to get to that end? I don't know. It's a very complicated prospect. And yeah, I'm not in full support, but I completely see the potential for this to be the silver bullet, the disrupting factor in terms of creating some change in the system. I wish we could just all focus on gardens and plant-based foods, because it's right there in front of us. But, will the market accept it is a completely different question.
Yeah, I think you would be hard-pressed to find a more horrific product than fetal bovine serum. You didn't mention, but it's it's unavoidable that the fetus and the mother die in its acquisition. So it's as a ghastly product, and it's pitched as a byproduct of the meat industry. So it's like, well, it's there anyway, whatever. But it doesn't have to be. We simply don't need slaughterhouses. So yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said there. For me, I'm in more or less full support of it. Well, firstly, I reached out to a couple of these leading institutions and startups and asked them if they had developed a way to make cultivated meat without using fetal bovine serum, and at least 3 places have done so. I don't know how much they share this information, but Good Meat, 3D, I forget its name, it's like 3D Biolabs or something, have done it, and the Good Food Institute knows of another that I've forgotten, but they can now do it without fetal bovine serum, which for me kind of, I know it came from a bad place, but it is heading in a good direction, and I for me, I support it because, yes, I would much rather that everyone just cut out all of the processed and unhealthy foods, but I simply know that's an unrealistic request. I would like it for everyone's personal health, but also selfishly, then when I go to a restaurant, I can just order without having to be very precise with the waiter and say, no dairy or egg. So I guess for me, it's just not letting the perfect get in the way of the good or be the enemy of the good. I think it will accomplish a significant reduction in animal suffering. And if people are still eating unhealthily, well, that's an imperfection, but I'd rather people be eating unhealthily and not harming animals than eating unhealthily and harming animals. So I don't know if I would eat it either, though. To answer my own question, maybe if I didn't think there was anything wrong with it, but I wouldn't do it as a healthy thing. It would be a guilty pleasure, I guess.
Yeah, we could stay on this topic for forever, I think. So I'll try not to stay on it too long. But just from an energy perspective, we're gonna be, it's gonna require a lab. It's gonna require lights and energy and heating and all of these controlled facilities to produce something that you can just grow in the ground, in the garden. So what I guess I'm saying is this the right direction? It kind of reminds me of the ETS at the moment and us with the climate, just trying to find all these techno fixes when, if we just went back to basics, we'd be avoiding all of these problems and we'd have a much more efficient and sustainable system. But yeah, like a point we've already, I suppose I've conceded on, it's very difficult to get people to move back to basics. But that's more what I'm interested in doing, is to promote those basics and the moving back to being a bit more humble and grassroots, or flax roots, I should say, instead of finding these technological fixes to maintain the current issue. Because, we're always going to have the new issue that's going to come up, and we're always going to be looking for the next technological fix. But it's better to just, fight it at the foundation, go back to basics, remove all of the techno garbage that's in the middle, creating these efficiency issues, and simplify things. But it's, and we're going to talk about capitalism later, while we live in a capitalist world, I think we know, what mode of production is going to come out on top, and what's going to be pushed onto the public and taken on by the masses while we're still living under a capitalist system.
The one that makes money.
Yeah.
You briefly mentioned earlier about taking inspiration from other movements. I guess you mean sort of justice and emancipation movements. And I went back and watched some of your old videos, and your first one is very good. The history of veganism one. I really enjoyed that, and it actually answered a lot of these questions for me. But so here's the thing. For me, I want, and I think this is the best way to go, and I welcome you to push back. I think that veganism is best as a discrete singular movement. Apolitical for sure, but not married to other movements either. And the reason I think this is because let's take politics as an easy example. If it becomes a left-leaning political issue, you immediately lose half the population on the right, because that's just the political landscape that we're in at the moment. And I think to a lesser degree, but still a similar thing happens if you align it to any other movement. If you take the LGBT movement and you say it's now married to this, you lose all the people that don't like that movement, or the Black Lives Matter movement, etc. So I think if veganism just comes in and just says, look, we're not with anybody else, but we appeal to the best principles that you hold, you should join us regardless of what other movements you're with. That's what I think is the best thing, the best way forward. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's interesting because I agree with the second half of what you're saying. I just wouldn't categorize that as being apolitical. I think there is a real problem with how, we're told to understand politics as being left and right. Then the reality that doesn't reflect how people think and see the world. And I think, our differences are being highlighted to cause just constant, forever division, and we squabble with each other and we don't actually focus on the real structures of power. So that's my view on the whole right and left thing. So I agree that we need to transcend these ideas of a left and right, and that we need to speak to these inherent values. And in fact, that's our whole thing, is that we want to push for more of a values-based society. But I don't think that makes it apolitical. And the reason for that is that animal oppression is political. And that's the thing, is that our response has to be political because the issue is political. And currently the power is held in politics. That's just the reality. Politics dictates where resources go. So as long as that's the case, as long as politics holds the key to power, we need to be working politically. So we need to be pushing for political change. Now, who do we push for political change? It's not a matter of left and right. It's just a matter of what parties have policies that align with our vision and views. None of them are perfect, right? None of them are vegan. So right off the bat, we can say that. However, some are more closely aligned. Like, for example, the Green Party have in their constitution, and I know they don't live up to this, but they have in their constitution non-violence as a value. That's something that we can potentially build on. And, we've already been in conversation with some of those people. They're more willing to listen to us and talk to us. Whereas on the other hand, you have, I would say that the kind of ideological opposite is ACT. And they're very pro-farming, right? They always resist any sort of policy change that might affect the income of farmers, and national too, and they are very open and honest about their alignment. Labour, they're very pro-farming too. They might be a little bit less vocal about it, but in reality, I would say National and Labour, especially if you consider historically and the work that Helen Clark did to help Fonterra become a monopoly, it has been pretty even in terms of those two parties. But yeah, I don't think we can ignore the fact that some policies are more closely aligned with our vision than others.
Yeah, labels are terrible, right? And we would all love to transcend all of these dividing factors of ourselves with one another. But I think it's just a reality that non-violence towards animals, not eating animals, raising up the profile of sustainable plant-based foods, there is more alignment in there, it seems, with the left than there is with the right. And I hate to, create the dichotomy, but there are natural allies that exist there. And more, now more than ever, we need to be working with natural allies on common ground, things that we agree on, so that we can, generate that people power and actually have some collective change. It's only a kind of tipping point that we need to reach before we start affecting social influence, having social influence. We need that tipping point rather than bringing everybody up to the standard together. So yeah, unfortunately, although I hate creating that divide, I think it's just a reality that we do have some natural allies out there.
And that comes from the very natural fact that where you see there is oppression of animals, you see that there's oppression of people. There's a lot of crossover between human rights issues and animal issues. Even though a lot of the human rights activists might not see it fully, but they are learning to, and I think, there is becoming an increasing awareness. The crossover is just too big to ignore. There's workers that are being exploited from the slaughterhouse, but also on the dairy farm. There is environment that's being destroyed. There's land that's being alienated from Indigenous people. No matter how you look at it, any social justice issue can be linked with animal oppression. So it makes sense for those movements to incorporate veganism or an animal justice lens, but it also makes sense for us because it strengthens our movement by working with those other spaces.
I agree completely with the left and right dichotomy being a false one, because to take my own political views, I agree with many things on the left and some things on the right, some things in the middle, some things on neither of that spectrum. And so there is no party probably anywhere in the world that I would completely agree with. And so what conclusion I draw from that is that, well, you can have a conservative, even far right wing vegan, and that their values might be consistent. I'd have to think about that a little more perhaps, but that there certainly are progressive people who are not vegan, and I would argue that their views are also inconsistent, or their practices are inconsistent with their beliefs. And so what I do with that is I say, right, well, just throw the political system out. Yes, there are political parties that are better for animals, and there are parties that are worse for animals. But what I want to do with that is just get vegans into the ACT party as MPs and just drag it in a better direction. I would love to debate David Seymour, because I think he's a very rational person, and I think that I could appeal to his rationality, and I don't think I could change his mind because I know he's entrenched, but I feel like I could at least, I don't know, make some progress there. I think that would be a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, if I can just say, it's hard because, say, for me, for example, our waterways, all across Aotearoa, our waterways are being destroyed by animal agriculture. A lot of Māori land, stolen Māori land, has animal farms on it. And then, I've been following Greenpeace for a really long time, and it's only maybe in the last 2 or 3 years that they've finally started talking about animal agriculture. And so, in terms of te ao Māori and justice for tangata whenua, animal agriculture is a big part of that conversation. In terms of liberating injustice and sustainability for our environment, animal agriculture is a big part of that conversation. And so, that's just my world, and that's just been a part of who I am and my upbringing. It's impossible for me to not see those issues and those intersections and those alignments, to separate out veganism and to not lean on those natural allies. Seems to be doing a disservice to not only myself and my veganism, but also those different justice movements, because it's when we come together that we have any chance of any type of progressive change.
I was just going to say, we're unfortunately small in numbers, the vegans. We're growing, but not nearly fast enough.
Yeah,
so I can see the appeal into grouping up.
Into grouping, yeah. I think we have to. I think vegans, and let's just be honest, I think vegans are always going to be a tiny minority, Let's say we get rid of all factory farms, we get rid of animal agriculture completely, convincing someone to not have backyard chickens, convincing someone to not go for a fish or to go hunting, and to have, some animal products once a month or something like that, I don't think that's realistic. I think those of us who really, really love animals and have compassion for animals and never want to contribute to that mindset of using an animal for our own benefit. I don't see that, I'm kind of being pessimistic. I want a revolution around this kind of thing and the spiritual uprising, but I think vegans are always going to be in that minority. I think if we don't align ourselves with other groups, we're just going to be fighting our own little minority fight for the rest of existence. And I think, for me personally, I'm more than that. I'm more than just a vegan, So I can't simply just talk about vegan issues and be in my own little minority vegan bubble. Me aligning myself with those other groups is just a natural application of my values which influence my veganism. And I think it's dumb of us vegans to reduce ourselves to simply being vegans. I mean, if that's your buzz, if you're just a vegan and you just care about animal issues, that's cool. But we're all such multifaceted human beings. So yeah, it's weird talking about it in isolation of just being a vegan or just being an animal rights activist, like it's a hat you wear or something. The values that influence your veganism and animal rights activism, particularly for myself, I have to apply it in all other aspects of my life. It's not something I just apply to animals,
I actually have a slightly more optimistic outlook on where society at large would go.
Thank goodness.
But I think it would just be very slow. And the reason I think is, if you just look at the way animals were treated by people directly in the past, I think it trends worse. Like dogs, pets. I know some people take issue with the idea of owning pets, but pets are treated very well. Farm animals are being treated slightly better. Not industrialized farm animals. I mean, when a person directly interacts with their animal, like a horse rider or something like that. And I think animal welfare is very slowly trending upwards. And the more we become aware, the better these animals will get treated, very, very slowly. But that eventually certain practices will become outlawed, and not only outlawed, but frowned upon by pretty much everybody. So that the people who don't see anything wrong with certain kinds of treatment, cages and things like this, will also stop doing it. And so I do think that we can get, in maybe 1,000 years or more, we can get to a world where animals are treated widely with the respect that they deserve, and that the kind of arguments that will get us there are arguments like, if you want to look at the compassion of a society, look at how they treat their most vulnerable, that being animals, and things like this. I think we can get there, but I understand the pessimistic view as well. And just to comment on the identity thing, because I think that's also a big conversation these days, is that, yeah, of course, like a vegan is not only a vegan. No activist is only that, and nobody is. This conversation is manifesting itself so perniciously in the pronoun debate, which I personally think is frivolous. But we don't have to go there. But it's just to say that people are so much more than a title. And so how I would respond to your saying that we got to be consistent with our values. It's absolutely. If you're a vegan, an ethical vegan for animal welfare issues, you're certainly, unless you have probably an irrational exclusion of humans in that consideration, then you're also going to be deeply concerned about human rights issues in your own country and overseas. So absolutely, a vegan would take on other issues of human rights, but that they, in my outlook, they can do that. We can all do that. It just wouldn't be done under the vegan umbrella. You would be a vegan and a something activist, and I don't see any contradiction there. And fortunately, our views are compatible there. We'd just think of ourselves ever so slightly differently.
I think you kind of touched on what I think is the problem with the separation. You said
Okay.
that we're trending towards better welfare, but industrially we're not. So despite
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
that being kind of an innate thing, right? We're compassionate, empathetic. You see how children react to animals. We know that it's something within us to be compassionate to animals. And I agree that I think, if anything, this feeling has grown on some level. But industrially, you know, things have gotten awful for animals over the last 200 years. Just the worst it's ever been at this point than it's ever been before. More animals are suffering now than ever before. And that's because the capitalist systems that hold them in those factories, in those places, and slaughterhouses are not reflective of the innate empathy within humans. So despite us promoting this vegan ethic, which I agree is what we should be promoting, if we don't kind of dismantle those capitalist structures that really don't care what humans think in terms of our views towards animals, then things won't get better for animals.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I wasn't quite clear when I said that things are getting better for animals over time. I realized, oh wait, but industrialized animal farming is certainly worse. I mean that only when people interact with animals directly, on the whole. But of course, industrial agriculture does put a veil over its horrific acts, and so the average consumer is ignorant to it intentionally and sometimes willingly. So yes, actually, you're actually right that yes, I think things are getting worse for animals overall, but as people become more considerate of animals that they do interact with, I think things are trending in the opposite direction. There's kind of a contradiction there, but one I can account for. So I agree. But I actually let's tackle this now. I wouldn't be so confident as to say that it's a capitalist system. And the reason for that is because I think that the same kind of mistreatment of animals would be present in other socio-economic systems. Like unless I'm mistaken about communist systems like, say, China, or to take China as an example. I mean, you must have seen the pig farm, the apartment pig farm that they're proposing. Horrible stuff. So I wonder how you could be so confident to attribute this sort of horror to capitalism specifically.
Well, I mean, China is a very capitalist place, right? I don't think that their economic model is reflective of communism, and I don't think that we have had such an example where we've had a good example of people owning the land themselves that they work on and owning the means of production themselves, not the state owning it. That's not what we want. We want the people to own it, and there's a big difference there. So I don't think that we have such an example, but we do have examples of indigenous cultures prior to the introduction of capitalism through colonization. And you don't have slaughterhouses. In none of those examples, you have slaughterhouses or the sort of industrial nature of animal oppression. And it can be traced back to capitalism quite easily. And people have done that. They've written books about how animal oppression grew with, industrialization, which is a capitalist development. And the idea of capitalism and animals actually, it's quite a deep one. We have, the word chattel, which came to mean cattle. They were, cows were seen as one of the predominant forms of wealth accumulation. And to think about the fact that tilling the land, using animals to till the land, was very closely linked to the development of private property and colonization. The word colony itself used to mean farm, used to mean settled farm. And that's because that's how it began. People used animals, and then they developed this idea that if your land is uncultivated, it's wasteland. And if it's cultivated, if you're cultivating it, it's yours, it belongs to you. And so everyone who had animals was able to till more land and then say, hey, I'm tilling it, I'm using it, it's mine. And they took a lot of commonly owned or commonly possessed land and stole it from people, essentially. People were then forced to either work on those farms for the owners, or they themselves had to go and colonize other land. And this spread and this continued right up until the colonization of Aotearoa. This was still the main model. And if you look at Aotearoa now, you see that it's all divided in these neat little squares that are used for animal agriculture.
Wasn't animal farming and using animals to till the land, hasn't that been around far longer than capitalism has been? It's in the Bible, and capitalism is like only a couple of 100 years old.
Yeah, like history of agriculture 10, 12,000 years ago. Capitalism is said to be this growing system. It came from feudalism. So it wasn't like everything, it developed over time. There's no starting point. So, and I would say the roots of it can be traced back to, I did open a big can of worms there, that's my bad. But it can be traced back to the way the animals were used to accumulate wealth. And but yeah, the drive to extract as much wealth from animals as possible, that's what led to factory farming, to simplify it in a more modern context.
Chris, did you want to add to that?
No, just on the point of China. China's usually raised as, they have this communist system, but we're living in a globalized world within what I would say is a globalized capitalist market, and so all of their systems and economies are of course influenced, impacted in every way by capitalism. So just to separate them out and use them as an example of an alternative, I think is just a little bit unfair, considering the globalized market that we live in, and that the main mode of production within our globalized economy is capitalism.
So would you think then that if we could build a system up and have a proper communist system or Marxist or whatever flavor of Marxism you want, do you think that based on the tenets of that structure, do you think it can actually work, or do you think that it is too prone to the corruption that leads to things like China and North Korea as two significantly different failings of the system, or Russia and Stalinism and all that horrific stuff?
Well, this is why I think it's better to look at pre-colonial indigenous models as opposed to these giant state-imposed models. Because I think really what we want is, to not get too kind of hung up on labels, is a decentralized system. So whether you want to call that communism or not is kind of up to you. But really what we want is smaller communities that can govern themselves. Because right now, under the global capitalist system, you really have a very small number of people with a lot of power. We're talking 3,000 billionaires in the whole world. That's such a tiny amount of people with a lot of say over what's going to happen around the world. And, even nothing against them, but you need a diversity of thought. And the more diversity of thought you have, the better. So I think the best thing to do is to let people govern themselves and their own community. And, people are governing the area that's directly around them, that they are living on, and making up rules that affect them and their families personally, and dealing with harm in ways that make sense to their communities, and so on. So that's definitely not capitalist. Whether it's communist or not, that's open to interpretation.
Yeah, it's, for me, my hesitation, that sounds lovely. I don't know if it holds up on the scale of societies that we have in the world. Maybe New Zealand is small enough, but if you take something like America, where there's 400 million people, maybe more, I don't know how you have small societies governing themselves. There needs to be some sort of distribution of resources. Say when a tragedy hits Florida, like the hurricane that's just hit them, there needs to be an agreed way to distribute support to them. And so, and now what we've done is I've just introduced a scenario where we need to have a broader system of I guess power really is the word, because you need to say, well, everybody that's not affected by this thing needs to help us who are affected, and then later on we'll help you when you're affected, sort of thing. And so that's, I guess, where I kind of still have reservations.
Yeah, we're really entrenched, right? And we're all currently reliant and benefiting on the current system. But I mean, things like that, like natural weather events and things. We can look here locally in Aotearoa, for example. There are a lot of floods in certain areas, or we've got Christchurch, for example, where there are repeated earthquakes. I hate to say it, but we shouldn't be living in these areas. First and foremost, we're forever having these natural disasters, which prove themselves to repeat over and over, and we're then reliant on this higher power, or this collective power of us to then pay a bill for something that we know is going to repeat itself. In a more decentralized, you could say, indigenous model, the practice would be to not live in those areas, and to then rely on your neighbors and to move your communities into different spaces and to join those other communities.
That's too simple.
Well, that's the thing. We are entrenched and reliant on this current system, but I think it's good for us to criticize it and to at least have an imagination and be brave enough to think about alternatives, rather than just kind of conceding and giving up and thinking that there's no other possible alternative.
Yeah, and I think that's probably where the differences between us come in typically, is because you guys propose certain ideas that sound great if we could get there, and I just go, I simply think, I don't see how we could possibly get there, let alone if we got there, would it work? But how do we progress from the system that we're in to that? So take the example of Christchurch. We have a bunch of people living in Christchurch who own property, and I know that I assume you guys are against property ownership, private property ownership, or that people would own their own property and not the state. You can clarify that. But for people to leave that area and go live somewhere else, they're giving up their wealth, their resources, their stuff, their home. So I don't see how we could kind of incentivize the move away from disaster-prone areas, just to use that as an example.
Yeah, distribution of private property. That's why everything needs to be in communal ownership, so you don't have that problem in the first place. But I mean, we are entrenched in this current system, and a lot of people have worked hard on cultivating their stolen land, and now they call it private property when it should instead be in communal ownership, so that we all have people's private property rights are infringing on our communal rights for a clean and safe environment. And so I'm not into private property rights. Everything should be in communal ownership, is my belief, because if you just pay someone to then take a piece of land and then you have the right to do whatever the fuck you want with that piece of land, with Mother Earth, I think it's just ridiculous. But I completely agree with you that we try and be aspirational. The pathway to get there is the hard part, right? But that's kind of my thing, is to simply be as aspirational as possible and to try and find other people who have insights into these potential alternatives for us to brainstorm ways. I'm not an expert in infrastructure and communities and even the economy. But if we're not being aspirational and not talking about these things in that way, then we can't make those connections with others who can actually help us to make our dreams a reality. So yeah, the exact pathway there, I'm as clueless as the next guy, to be quite honest. But Samah, maybe.
Oh, I just want to say on that point, like, that we need a central governance to protect us in these disaster situations. I don't think that that's necessary. I think that I believe in humankind, and I believe that we want to work together. I think, just as I'm throwing this out, like Chris said, like, we're not experts, and like, we don't even think we're the ones to come up with the solutions. We want to, together come up with solutions. But one thing that we could do is we could have a a constitution between these small communities. It's not like we can be divided. Like we're too interlinked now, as you say. We rely on each other too much. There's no reason why we can't cooperate and have a system of cooperation, but ultimately you govern your community. The state can't come in and say, we're imposing this law beyond the constitution, say, the constitution says you can't kill people or enslave people or whatever. But beyond those things, those obvious things, the government can't come and say, you can't build a house there because we want to do this or that. So that's the idea. And Harry, if you can believe that global veganism is possible, surely you can believe that we can move towards this decentralized system.
Yeah, touche. Do you mind if I take you into the weeds a little bit? Because there's some conclusions that communal property ownership runs amok for me. And so to take a very simple example of how do you keep people, does somebody have the right to have their own house? Like, would I, if my house was communally owned, could I say I don't want anybody else to come in to my house right now? And am I allowed to lock the door? How does something like that square up?
Oh, you'd all have to, it's like a family. You'd create these rules in your communities. You'd come to, agreements on all these things. And that happens through wānanga. That happens through coming together and having discussions. It's impossible for us right now to talk about your example and to make any definitive calls. Like for me, myself, I have some whenua just outside of Kaikohe, a little place called Aotearoa, and it's in communal ownership. And so my whānau, we have some shares in this whenua. We can't just do whatever the fuck we want. We have to go to each shareholder. Say if I was to put a house there, a whare, I'd have to go to each shareholder and discuss with them my plan and then to get their permission to have occupancy. And so, what that means is that I can't just go in and do whatever the hell it is that I want. I'm accountable to other people in my community. And so, then that encourages discussions, it encourages relationships between people, it encourages having a mindset where we know we have to think about the communal benefits of everyone. What I want as an individual within that system is kind of irrelevant, and it will have to, I will have to take sacrifices and compromise in terms of my own individual wishes and desires, because it's going to then be influenced and ultimately dependent on those communal conversations and aspirations of us as a community. So, it's hard. There's no short answer. It depends on the people who have shares. It depends on other people who have responsibilities to those areas. It's a long conversation. And for me and my whānau, we have some disagreements, The kind of whare that I want to put on my land is not going to be exactly what I want, because I am having to take into consideration communal considerations. So it's tricky. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of that I like, consulting the community and things like this. It makes perfect sense. I don't want my neighbors to build a ugly sky-rise building right next to my house and block the sun, for example. But for me, certain very important elements are privacy. Somebody who's introverted, but I think even extroverted people might just want occasionally to be able to lock themselves in their house and say, no guests, no visitors, and nobody's even allowed on the property. I'm just going to be a hermit for a day. And if I had to consult the community or ask for permission to be left alone, that would kind of be strange.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
that on my own property I could do certain things that I didn't need to have permission of the society to do. As long as I'm not drilling for oil or something like that, making up something like this, but just personal private things that I would have my fortress.
Your fortress, right? Yeah, this, and what a privilege that would be, right? for all of us to have this cut off from the rest of the world, don't even have to worry about other animals interacting with us. We're just in our own little bubble. And I would describe myself as an introvert, which I think a lot of people would be surprised at. But all of our homeless people, for example, the fact that all of us are so privileged and being able to lock ourselves away in our individual dwellings while there are so many people out there who have needs, that's the thought that I keep coming back to. If I'm on this communal land and this land here is here to serve and look after all of us, the idea of me putting up a single dwelling for myself when there are other people who also need to use what I would say those communal resources, that's the issue. Like, we need to look at the needs of the community, which I would say should then dictate what we're able to do as individuals. And so, we're all used to having our own bedroom, that's a lovely thing, but for a lot of people, a lot of communities, a lot of other countries, much tighter dwellings. You could have like multiple families living in one house. And so now this idea that we're all entitled to our own private space that gives us extreme privacy, where we're able to do whatever we want, is a privilege that I think a lot of us take for granted and shouldn't necessarily be the baseline in terms of what our expectations are, in terms of what we consider to be fair. I think we're all very used to having those privileges and privacies and things like that, and it's become the baseline. And I think because it's become the baseline, these conversations now become quite difficult. But for a lot of cultures, it would be considered an extreme privilege for that to be a baseline.
But if it was possible, I see no reason why a community can't decide, yep, you have your own little house that you can lock and do whatever you want, and your own little backyard that you can play around with, but that these privileges can be renegotiated. So if you do start drilling oil in your backyard, we can all come together as a community and say, hey, we don't like that you're going to do that. If you're not going to stop, we're actually going to force you off this land. And that's the beauty of not having private property, is that you can renegotiate as a community, like I say, with a constitution, not in a lawless, crazy, anarchy, but with some values that are, that can also be renegotiated. Like, right, constitutions can be adapted and changed. But there's no reason why, if it was possible, we can't allow people to have that freedom as long as they abide by the rules.
Yeah, and I'll just add and say, as long as people are abiding by the rules, and as long as it's not a system that encourages inequality, that's essentially what it comes back to. If one guy decides my house is going to be really big and take up 50% of the land, but there's still 3 other people and they can't also have 50%, if there's enough resources within this collective for everyone to have what they want, then it's fine. But it's when it starts to create some form of imbalance that there's an issue.
Yeah, I think the idea for me that my dwelling can be renegotiated by other people is quite unappealing. I would be far more agreeable if it was, once we negotiate with my community that I can have my house and I'm allowed to lock it at my discretion, and that will never change unless I decide or offer the change. That would be a lot better, because otherwise, when I've locked my door, I could be wondering, well, what if the community just renegotiates the locked door policy and kicks me out, and that would take away the security that I was looking for in the first place. So that kind of undoes that for me.
Yeah, I understand exactly where you're coming from, but it's like, we want to sign that piece of paper so that I can have it forever. Yeah. So no matter what I do, I'm safe. I could become an alcoholic, rapist, antisocial, whatever, and at least I know that I'm gonna be able to
certain things are off the table.
That's what it sounds like.
So you can lock yourself in, no drilling for oil, no breaking the law, no breaking the moral law. These sorts of things. It's
no eating animals.
Yeah. And that once that's signed, it's like if it was agreed that I could drill for oil, you can't stop me drilling for oil when I start to do that. So you gotta get those things out of the way. So in suburban communities, you can't drill for oil. You just can't do that. So if someone drilled for oil, it's not breaking any agreement to come in and stop them. Likewise, my neighbors are unfortunately loud. They're not allowed to be loud at night. Sometimes they are. Noise control will go and shut them up, and that's not a breach of any agreement. It's all agreed ahead of time. So
that's the nub of it, eh? The agreement has to be right, because we're talking about being able to renegotiate private property rights. At the moment, it would seem that the agreement allows for a lot of things that probably need to be winded back a little bit. I think is kind of the nub of it.
Yeah.
These are inalienable rights. It shouldn't be inalienable, like the things that we let people get away with on their land, and still it's very hard to take land off them. Like, even if they go to prison, often they will continue owning that land.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
I see the problem. I don't think taking away the land is the solution. I know exactly the waterways problem is a pernicious one, and I'm I want to say go on and take the land away from them, but I think you can say once they affect land downstream, literally, of their property, you can come after them and say, hey, because it comes down to that whole thing, right? Like, you can do whatever you want to yourself, but as soon as you start affecting other people, then people can have a say. And so polluting waterways is not only affecting their own land, it's causing wider problems. And so I'm not actually against kind of strict enforcement of affecting what people do on their property when they're polluting. So I don't think there's any contradiction there in my views. Just on the privilege point, I don't know if I would disagree that it's a privilege, but I just would say that it's a good privilege that we might aspire everybody could have. Would you disagree with that response?
To aspire everyone to be enabled to have that privilege?
So
I'd say that's fair.
Yeah, so everybody could have their own house, and then it's not like, oh, somebody's building a house while we have 3 homeless people living on the street outside. It's like, no, the homeless people have their house, or at least have the option to have a house, and they've chosen to sleep outside because they want to. Now, not that I'm suggesting many people would do that, but that once there is equality of opportunity, then there can be differences in how people choose to live their life, and it's no longer, it's a privileged thing. It's like, yeah, well, everyone's got a house, let's leave them in their houses and they can keep them. How's that for a
if
idea?
there is that equality of opportunity, I think it's fine to have this aspiration if it were actually possible, and I think if we look at our current statistics of homelessness, housing affordability for people, I would say it's not possible in the state of things.
Pretty bad at the moment.
And so I would say it's a good and fair aspiration to have, but only if it's actually possible. If those of us who are thinking about this aspiration and wanting this for ourselves, as long as the system of achieving it actually allows for the possibility, of that value, of that aspiration to actually be met.
I feel like we've flipped positions now. I think before I was saying we can't get to your optimistic goals, and now you're saying we can't get to mine.
Well, I mean, I do think it is an extreme privilege and a bad baseline for us to have, but I'm saying if it is possible, which I don't think it currently is, then I think it is fine to have it as a baseline. But what I'm saying is I don't think it's actually possible.
But is working towards it a bad thing to do?
No, working towards aspirations is fine.
Okay.
But I'm saying if the mode of the pathway that we have to try and work towards it isn't actually realistic, then I think it's it's a fine aspiration to have, but the pathway that we're chasing, it simply needs to be realistic. Yeah, it needs to be possible.
Yeah, because capitalism is my system to get there. So, and I know you take issue with that. So, no contradictions.
You want to talk about capitalism more?
Oh boy.
I was just going to give you the invitation. I was going to say that you've obviously not a capitalist or a fan of it. I mean, the majority of our homeless population are Māori. The reason why they've been dispossessed of their lands is because of private property ownership. If we were to move back into communal ownership of Māori land,
then we'd have a lot more space to put people who have been disenfranchised and, alienated from a form of land ownership. They've been completely alienated of a form of land ownership, and that has been because of private property rights. And so for me, moving into a more communal model is the exact way that we would be able to have some form of solution to our current, particularly homeless statistics. Achieving it through capitalism, I don't know. A lot of things can be achieved through capitalism. I don't think capitalism is inherently, in and of itself, evil. I just think the popular and modern application of it today has led us to some really problematic places. I think most people, even Christopher Luxon, we can always improve on things. Everyone would agree that we can improve on capitalism, switch it up a little bit, give it a little bit, in his own words, to improve it. It's possible. But I would say it has led us to where we are today. And moving more to a communal ownership is exactly the way we need to move to to get more Māori back on their own land.
Forgive my ignorance here, but are there not iwi that own considerable amounts of land that could set up such a system and have it within New Zealand and have a community area? Like you mentioned that your family is part of one, and is that working out, or could we broaden that and have the capitalist system within New Zealand and have communal areas within it as well?
I'm not too sure. Like I said, I'm not an expert on economies or infrastructure, but we live in a capitalist society. We have certain marketplaces that are available, and so for Māori, particularly, I think it's Ngāti Whātua, they have a huge portfolio of properties. And those properties and the ability to have those properties were given to them through settlements. And these settlements have given us back a fraction of the value of what should have been given back to Māori. And now we're passing judgment on them for, participating in our current economic model for them to regenerate wealth that should have been given back to them. And now we're saying to them, well, hey, how about you just give up everything that you were given through your settlement, which has only given you like 1% of the value of what you should have been given. And you now need to start a not-for-profit charity, and you need to just be doing, all this humanitarian work instead of doing what everyone else is currently doing in our current capitalist model of just driving for more and more wealth. So, we live in a capitalist system. And, whether it's Māori moving into dairy farming or Māori moving into owning property, they're just participating in the same economic pathways that we've built infrastructure around that everyone else is participating in. Could they use their settlement money to start a revolution? Probably not, because we live under a colonial capitalist system that encourages certain pathways. Is it possible for us to pivot into other pathways? We're going to need constitutional change to enable Māori to have those systems actually become sustainable. We can't create these alternative societies while the current political system essentially demands that we all participate in this capitalist system.
Because I don't see the need for them to give up anything. Just take everything that you have already. I guess if it is geography constrained to have a open community, you've got to assumably have them in close proximity. But it is just to say that you don't actually need to participate in capitalism if you're self-sustained, if you're living off the land, if you're everything that you need you kind of produce. And this area can be the size of a town or a city or a couple of towns, and you just say, right, well, we don't do trade, at least not significantly with the capitalist system outside us. We just live here and we just do it. Is that's what I'm I just don't see the need for a constitutional a mandate to enable that to happen. I mean, what am I missing here?
You're missing the fact that Te Tiriti o Waitangi is not honoured, and Māori actually don't have their own sovereignty to actually do that. And that's all Māori actually want, is for actually the ability to do what you're kind of describing. but legally we can't. We don't have the ability to govern ourselves. We have to pay rates. We have to, all the normal laws that everyone is under is the same for us. And so this kind of self-sufficient, not trading society, I don't see it as being possible in any way. We all need jobs at the end of the day. Do you expect someone to just go and live in their house and just garden all day long to create their own food and entertainment, and to just cut themselves off from the rest of society?
You still have to buy solar panels.
Solar
and
panels, wood
and,
for your
you know,
toothpaste, and
to process the wood. Just everything in our system currently is it doesn't allow for that, and that's why people are calling for a constitutional change to honour te tiriti and simply say, hey, Māori, you can govern yourselves. That's all that is promised in the treaty, and I think there's been a lot of fear-mongering around it. Māori aren't asking to govern everyone. They just want the ability to govern themselves on their own land, which requires land as well. And another problem is a lot of the land that iwi have is quite marginal land. Like for us, we're going to have a lot of help from our family to just build a driveway and then put the tiniest of houses that we can afford on there. So, and we're privileged a little bit to be able to do that. So a lot of people, they won't have that ability. There is, you can imagine the massive shift we'd need to enable what you're talking about. But that's the dream, essentially, what you're talking about.
So I think I understand what I was missing. Let me explain it back to you and tell me if I go wrong. So what I tried to do was say, take the ideal that you describe and don't change New Zealand as a whole or society as a whole, and just take your ideal and put it somewhere inside New Zealand and let it function. And what I missed was that if you do that, you cut it off from the resources, the surplus resources and progression of the broader society. So today I benefit from shipping and manufacturing that happens overseas, and a power grid that is generated God only knows where, and all sorts of things, and the internet and all of these things that I have to pay for on a regular basis. So if I was to say, okay, go away and do your own thing and don't produce goods to sell, you don't get the trade. You don't get all of the goods that are generated by society. So what I was thinking was, if you want to live off the land, go live off the land. But it's like, well, yeah, but then we can't pay for the things that we're used to. As frivolous but as meaningful as movies and entertainment and all that. Am I right there that I would be suggesting a significant decrease or decline in general well-being and opportunities? Is that how have I done?
Trade was something that Māori did with not just between iwi, but with other countries. And so, I guess if this example of an alternative society of Māori sovereignty, tino rangatiratanga, were to take place here in Aotearoa, it would be the same as anything else. We'd open up trade agreements, between Northland and Tamaki, or, an iwi in the north and an iwi in the south, or anyone. Trade would still exist. But I guess, economies of scale would be very different. Our availability to produce certain things would be lacking. And so for a fair trading system or economy, it would have to be nationalized in some way. We're not just there to cut ourselves off and say no to everything. We would still produce something. We would have to. And we would probably want whatever it is they've got in Te Waipounamu, whether it's, a certain type of quinoa or whatever. Hopefully we can produce something in our neck of the woods and they can produce something. There would be trade. Trade agreements would exist. I think it wouldn't be any different to what we have today.
But one of the problems of having it in the middle of that is that you would still have the impact of all of that around you as well, right? So, the damage to the waterways, for example. If you don't stop them doing that, you might not even be able to do it.
What I thought was implicit in the kind of Garden of Eden that you described was a lack of surplus material, so that you only took what you needed from the land and no more. And the reason why I thought that was a core tenet was that if you are producing more and trading, I think you're well on your way to a capitalist system. And that it just simply becomes, well, if we produce more, if we take more from the land, we make more money. And then we can build more things and have more stuff. And that is essentially capitalism, right? So how do you stop your system turning into capitalism?
It was already operating without capitalism, you know. I don't think we need to venture too far to look for examples. It was happening in Aotearoa just 200 years ago with trading. And, you know, it's not taking more than you need, right? Because if I grow lots of apples and I have enough for my family, it's still only one tree that gave me apples, but it's going to give me more than there is for my family. It makes total sense for me to trade my apples with my neighbor's lemons because they have a lemon tree. So that kind of surplus, I think, is different to the extraction of wealth for capitalism kind of surplus.
So as long as you didn't plant a second apple tree and start trading with the neighbors further down the street.
I think it's all about the harm that it's doing to the communal environment. I mean, if capitalism is simply defined as a mode of production that produces surplus, then that's pretty much every economic or production model that's ever existed. I mean, old school Māori agriculture, it was just normal to produce surplus because you never knew when a drought or a plague or anything is coming in. The production of surplus has always been a natural part of any economy, I would say. But this is the problem with labels, and there'll be huge gray areas here. You know, the fact that it's flipped into now being capitalism, I think is a little bit of a simplistic view of it. But I understand the mentality of, hey, how do you stop it from tipping into these dangerous areas? And that's where I guess for me it simply comes back to that the communal nature of having to be responsible to everyone in that area and something that produces inequality. If those two things are happening, some type of drop in the quality of our communal resources and a system that creates a form of inequality, then we're tipping into the realm of capitalism. That's more my understanding and definition of capitalism, and simply the production of surplus for trading with other nations and whatnot. As long as it's not doing those negative aspects, I wouldn't tip it into that negative realm of labeling it capitalism.
Right. Are you familiar with Garrett Hardin's The Tragedy of the Unmanaged Commons?
Can't say, no.
Okay. It's a kind of, I'll summarize it very quickly. It's essentially, if you have a communal resource, and the example used, I think, is a fishing pond, and if 3 people can fish and take 1 fish a day, then it will sustain them forever. But if 1 person takes 2 fish, the population of fish will decline, and it affects everybody negatively because now there's not enough fish for anybody. And so the tragedy is that if just 1 person in an unmanaged commons being the lake, is greedy, it negatively affects everybody. And this generalizes in so many ways, like even oxygen is a commons, right? If people pollute, it negatively affects everybody. And it's a really core issue that kind of needs to be worked out for every system, really. It's not a criticism to you guys, but I was going to ask how you solve that. And Garrett puts forward some measures, and that's why he retitled it to be the unmanaged commons. Originally it was just the tragedy of the commons, but it's only if it's unmanaged, and so the communal aspect requires management, essentially, is what he's trying to say, which I know you're not opposed to. You've said that there would be some sort of overarching system of agreement, a constitution, but it's just a specific kind of a thought experiment that's challenging and fun.
Yeah, I mean, it is fun. I feel like we're kind of circling around a few times here, because this is kind of the problem. Like if you have a lake and you put it into private property ownership rather than a communal model, then you might have someone taking too many fish out of that lake. But in my understanding of a more communal model where everyone would be discussing the rights and our responsibilities to that lake, like the constitution that you're talking about in terms of an agreement that we'd have to make, to me that seems resolvable more in the aspect of communal ownership rather than private ownership.
I'm keeping an eye on the time, but I wanted to move on. I wanted to ask you guys about pest control, because this is something that I saw a video you guys made, and I admire it, but I disagree with it. And so so I'll just say pest control. Should we kill pests to save wildlife?
We think no, for the simple fact that we are coming at it from an animal rights perspective, which really looks at the right of the individual to live and to be free, whereas conservation has more of a lens over the rights of groups of species, and that's the kind of basic disagreement that we have. That aside, there is the fact that we think pest control is being used as a distraction from what we really need to do in order to save our environment and to save our native species as well. And yeah, there's a lot to say. There's the animal rights issue is at the heart of it, right? Because we don't think that, for the same reason that we don't think it's okay to kill humans to save certain species, we don't think it's okay to kill animals to save certain species, because we have the same lens of justice for the animals that we do humans. So that doesn't mean that we don't care about native species. It just means that we don't think that that's the solution that we should apply. Certainly, we think it should be the very last tool in the toolbox, if it's going to be a tool at all. So is it being used as the last resort? We think not. We think that there is a lot of directly damaging things that we are doing right now that are killing our native species that we're refusing to stop, while also scapegoating our guilt, I would say. I think that the current manifestation of pest control is coming from that guilt of, oh, look what we've done. We've destroyed so much. We're going to lose these species forever, these species that have become part of our identity. And we don't want to change what we're doing, but we also don't want to lose these parts of our identity. And so this is what we do to make up for that. We're like, okay, we'll just try and keep them alive in these little zoos so that they exist forever, even though everything around them might be falling apart.
There's a lot to say on this, and I just wanted to say we probably should have started by saying we don't have enough time to give this the context that it deserves, because this is such an emotional topic. Defending our birds, defending our taonga species. It's almost along the lines of that narrative of, oh, haven't Māori suffered enough? Hasn't Aotearoa suffered enough that we have to at least look after this indigenous aspect of Aotearoa? And so there's all of that emotional response of really wanting to protect that aspect. We've already done so much harm, so how can we at least protect one of these last little aspects of some type of indigenous Aotearoa? So just to let all of the listeners know, that this does require a lot of context, and it's very, very deep as this conversation, and we don't mean to reduce it too much. It really deserves like a couple hours, a whole presentation. But yeah, largely I agree with everything Samah said. Primarily for me, the issue is that I do see it as this distraction, because when we see green jobs proposed by the government, funding going into our environmental space, generally it's taken up by conservation, and we scapegoat these possums and rats and stoats, whereas other introduced species, like the cows and the sheep, and deer and all of those other animals that we use in agriculture, they get less attention put on them than what I think they deserve. And I wish I could have both. It's kind of like one of those ethical dilemmas. If a cat shows up on my doorstep, I have to feed them meat. I'm not just going to let them starve. And now for me, we have a similar situation with rats and other introduced animals that are, even cats themselves that are killing introduced species. I now feel that we have a moral obligation to consider their welfare at the very least. And our current responses to killing these animals is incredibly cruel, and I would say completely void of that consideration of their welfare. And so that's the problem that I take with it. And that it is such a distraction. All of our environmentalists and conservationists who are interested, they are looking at careers into how do we kill these animals, how do we control these animals, rather than looking at the root of the issue, which I would say is more around animal agriculture.
Just as an aside, I forgot to mention when we were talking about cultivated meat, but as a vegan, even if I didn't eat it, I think cultivated meat is a fantastic product to feed pets like dogs and cats.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I
Provides a solution there.
yeah, I'm really happy about that, certainly, because we have a
Though they are making vegan pet food these days, though. Synthesized.
I'll be honest, I haven't fully
whatnot.
looked into that properly. I understand that dogs can be vegan, but cats can't. I don't know. But even so, even if you could make a dog vegan, I'd rather feed it cultivated meat and have it be an ethically salient solution, and the dog can have whatever it wants. That's a by the by.
Yeah. I'll just say, just for our sake, it's quite similar to the B12 discussion, the taurine. Like a lot of the commercially produced cat foods have the taurine, like synthetically produced taurine, added after the fact, because of all the processes and whatnot that happens. The meat naturally loses its taurine in a lot of our commercial cat foods, and so the synthetic taurine that's added to commercial meat-based foods is the same synthetic taurine that's added to a lot of vegan cat foods.
That's
Funnily enough, but yeah.
We don't have a cat at the moment, so I haven't had cause to look into it. But we do have a dog, and he's a rescue, and so he came to us being used to eating chicken, and so we still buy him chicken, and it is an ethical dilemma that I can't actually square up, other than to say that I'm biased towards this particular animal and would sacrifice other animals for his protection. In a non-biased way, it's probably unjustifiable, but it's just a bias that I harbor and act upon. It's an interesting dilemma. Back to the pest control though, there's actually far less disagreement that I have. I just simply see it as a trolley problem, essentially, that if we pull the lever, we kill pests. If we don't pull the lever, the many native species will die. And so, as unhappy as I am about having to pull the lever, that's the choice that I make. And I get the concern. It's unpleasant. It's barbaric. I wouldn't want to carry out the action myself. But that ultimately that's the conclusion that I currently come to. So I guess I agree with everything else that you said in there. If there was a solution to taking introduced predator animals like possums and stoats out of the factor without killing them or harming them in any way, absolutely, I'm all for that. Even if it's 10 times as expensive, let's do it. I guess I don't know. I haven't thoroughly looked into it if there are such systems, but I know they're having trouble with poison, and that's surely the easiest. So I don't know how they would manage with more constraints.
I guess what I would say about that is that our current conservation strategy simply isn't working. And, I hope that that's a baseline that we can all at least agree on, people who are pro and against our current measures of pest control. It's not working. It's just simple fact, that over 90% of our invertebrates are at risk of extinction. Over 80% of our shorebirds, similar stats in fact, we have some of the worst stats for endangered native species in the world, despite us being a world leader in pest control. We actually potentially might be number one in the world in terms of pest control. So, it's similar to how dairy says calcium is important for bones. We have to give everyone calcium, and yet the countries that consume the most calcium seem to randomly have some of the worst rates of osteoporosis. We can't really,
Not so randomly.
yeah, not so randomly, right? And I think that we have a similar thing here because pest control is a greenwashing arm of the colonial state. So I'll just give two really quick examples that I think illustrate this really beautifully. An article I read in the Dom Post a couple of weeks ago, it was from 2021. It's called the Kaitiaki of Te Urewera. And it was about this man who had been looking after that forest for a very long time. And he described how there used to be so many berries around that he would trip up on them. It was just all over the ground. But now it's really hard to find the berries. And these berries are important for everyone, not just the birds that live there. But he described how the berries go in the water and they flow out to other areas. And then the tuna and other fish also rely on these berries. And he said that there's just like barely any berries left in this area. And he says, everyone says it's the possums. I don't think it's the possums because we have much less possums now. And yet it's really difficult to see these berries. And then the other anecdote that I want to say is if you look at the Jobs for Nature, and I implore you to do so because it gives you a really good image of what we're spending money on when we say we're spending money on nature. So Jobs for Nature was like 1 point something billion that we're putting towards nature. Sounds amazing, Then you look into it, and one of the programs that they're doing, along with a whole bunch of other time-wasting things that are aimed at improving the agricultural system, a lot of it is actually just about helping the agricultural system. One of the programs called Kiwi for Kiwis or something like that, it allocates $17 million just to increase the number of Kiwis around the country. That's its sole focus through predator control. So it's a predator control program, and it's going to measure its outcomes on the number of Kiwis. Now, I think that's a problem because it's not going to tell us whether our environment is better. It's not going to tell us whether overall our native species are better, even if we're just looking at native species, which I think is wrong because everyone lives in an ecosystem. And it takes everyone to make a flourishing ecosystem. But even if we were just using that measure of native animals, well, looking at the number of Kiwis going up doesn't tell us anything, Is the number of native insects up in that area? Is the climate different? Is the water cleaner? And I think that hits at the heart of the problem, and you can see that in both stories. When you just have tunnel vision and you just look at one aspect of the ecosystem and you say, if I just remove this threat or whatever thing that you're projecting all of our problems onto, everything will be fine. And we have time and time and time and time again seen the evidence that that's simply not true. We need to have a holistic response to a holistic problem. We need to make sure every aspect of the ecosystem is doing well so that the animals have a healthy habitat, which means they will be healthy, right? And it's that more, I think, indigenous perspective of the world as well. It's looking at all the issues together all at once and not separating them out. And I think that that's the problem with our conservation strategy. It's looking at it in isolation.
That's a really interesting perspective, and I will just defend conservation efforts with one point, and that is that I understand that they've successfully made the Miramar Peninsula rat-free, which was a big goal, and they seem to have accomplished it. But I take your point that doesn't say anything positive about what that means. It doesn't say that there is an increase in XYZ, and I can't say that there certainly is. I will admit it was an assumption that if you take out the predator animals, then the animals that naturally evolved not to have predators would then flourish again, but they also might struggle under other constraints. And yeah, you're right. I don't actually know what a rat-free Miramar Peninsula means for the other creatures that live there.
I might have more sympathy for that if they were like eating the rats or something, but they're not doing it for any essential need. It's just because we like the look of some birds. You know, we want to look at our shores and see a diversity of different animals. And I don't think that's a fair reason to trap and poison these animals, unfortunately. You know, I think it's still that emotional response that we're fighting. People don't want to reduce biodiversity. And so then we justify it by, you know, treating these animals in all sorts of cruel ways. And just for me, it's always coming back to that. Is it a justifiable reason to kill these animals? And the justification that most people seem to come at us with is, I like the look of birds. I want to have birds around. I want to have rare animals around for my own enjoyment. And I think we're favoring our own enjoyment of having those nice looking birds and not considering the welfare of these animals.
Perhaps I need to amend my earlier trolley problem, because it's actually more consequential than that. It's if you pull the lever, you kill the pests and you save the natives. But if you don't pull the lever, the trolley hits the natives, they get wiped out, and then the food for the pests is also gone, and so they get wiped out as well. And so it's actually a scenario, if I'm not oversimplifying it, which I probably am, it's a situation where you have one or none, and the only one is the natives. You can't have the pests without the natives, but you can have the natives without the pests.
And I think that's certainly the argument that's put out from the mainstream conservation space. If we don't kill these animals, everything will collapse. Our entire ecosystem will collapse. I just simply don't think that's true. And you know, we have some areas that we don't do pest control in. We can look at them, and maybe you might be able to say there's more of this, or less or more of certain birds and certain species. But then I would just retort by saying, okay, but let's look at the overall health of that ecosystem, and put everything into context. And I don't think anyone's done the analysis where they're like, oh no, I can certainly say in this area we killed these rats, and now overall everything, including the water and the insects, is doing healthier. I think it's impossible to do that analysis, and so I think that it's not a scientific argument. And this is what the people who write against conservation, because I've been reading a lot of people from scientists in the compassionate conservationist space who know way more than me about this. They show the holes in the science. They actually show, hey, your conclusion doesn't follow from your premises. You actually haven't proven the outcomes that you're saying you're doing. So I simply just don't believe that would happen.
And also, you know, this whole trolley cart situation, you know, if we involve the fat man, you know, and then we have to be the ones, you know, it's more emotional when it's the fat man. Do we want to involve ourselves in killing that fat man? You know, when we become complicit, like it switched for me when I once saw a Tim's trap. It's the yellow possum traps that are really popular, and it had a pukeko in it. And, you know, a lot of people say that pukeko are pests, even though, of course, they're native. So, you know, there's a blurred line there. It's ridiculous. You know, we kill all sorts of native animals, actually, you know, paradise shell ducks and whatnot, because they're an agricultural pest. You know, I saw this possum trap killing a species that it wasn't designed to kill. And then it kind of just hit me that this current method that we have of trying to kill certain species, it's just there's flaws to it. And then it made me think about a 1080 drop, and I said, you know, would I be able to be the one to pull the lever to drop that 1080? Like, would I be able to be the one to push the fat man and block the trolley? I don't think I could be that person. And so then for me, that's when it for myself, I had to kind of rethink my attitude towards introduced species and what I was comfortable with. You know, it's like, if you're not comfortable killing an animal yourself, why are you comfortable paying someone else to do it? For me, it was the same thing in terms of our conservation space. If I personally am not comfortable with killing those animals myself, and I used to shoot possums, go hunting for possums. I'd set rat traps and all that before I was vegan. And actually, I was a vegan who used to advocate for killing introduced species. I was very comfortable once upon a time. Even while I was doing activism out on the streets and preaching about animal rights, I did have this conflicting view of introduced species. But it wasn't until I saw that pukeko in the Tim's trap and just some cogs started to spin for me It made me rethink and made me realize that I needed to have a more consistent view on liberation and justice for animals.
Yeah, and you
Right.
know,
Paradise ducks are my favorite ducks.
really,
That's sad that they're considered pests. They're
yeah.
they're beautiful.
Beautiful, beautiful animals, yeah.
And then we farm and
Yeah.
sell and export eels, and yeah, the white baiting is legal. There's lots of native animals that we kill, and then lots of non-native animals that we deliberately breed, right? Like
And protect.
we're still breeding dogs and cats and deer and cows and sheep, despite all of them being pests if they cross outside of
Yeah.
the fence, you know.
Yeah, and there's
Yeah.
also the fact that, our conservation laws were first set up around hunting. And I think the first protected animal in terms of the law was like introduced trout or something like that, And so the conservation space goes incredibly
Right.
deep in terms of what its initial foundation was set upon. And it's now morphed a little bit,
Yeah.
but it's inarguable that its foundations were not there to protect the wildlife or native species. It was there to protect people's rights to be able to hunt certain animals and to do certain activities. And so it's a blurry gray space. And I think it's often reduced and simplified to, but we have to because of our taonga species that we're otherwise going to lose. And people are unable to see past that emotional
Barrier.
barrier.
Yeah. Yeah. I see a lot of this as arguments for better conservation as opposed to arguments against conservation, because all of that consideration and the hypocrisy within conservation I see as valid, and I agree with a lot of it. And I would simply say that, okay, yeah, well, we need some conservation, but stop killing paradise ducks for one thing, and maybe we certainly don't need the amount of sheep and cattle that we have. I'm not saying slaughter them. I'm saying let that naturally progress as quickly as we can do it. So I'm agreeing with all of that. But for the final point of and if we need more research, let's do it. But we need to. I do think it is justified to protect the native species against the introduced predator that their natural habitat does not possess. And beauty is a factor. I do think that it is something to have beautiful variety of wildlife, but that it's also just for their own sake, not to be torn to pieces by a predator and watch their nest be destroyed and children eaten.
Yeah, but we have native species that are predators themselves, Like it's just ridiculous, this predator-free 2050 thing, and then we think of, the moorpork or different predator hawks and falcons and whatnot that we have.
Then we have a hawk, yeah.
Even if we were to remove all of the introduced species and just have native species, they'd still be killing each other. Whether it's them animals killing other animals or the animals killing bugs, it's still that endless cycle of life and death. And so the kōrero that people bring up around, but isn't it sad that they die in the wild? It's like, well, they're wild animals, and there's always death in the wild. And so, I would love to have beautiful birds, have your cake and eat it too kind of thing, but I think people use that as an emotional argument. These poor animals, they're getting ripped to shreds. It's like, well, that would be happening anyway if there was a normal circular ecosystem that there once was before the introduced species.
It's funny because the biggest killer.
The balance is off, though.
Yeah.
Sorry, you go, Samah.
But why? Why is that balance off? It's to do with our human actions.
Humans.
Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. And I don't know if there is any credence to the idea that we can put it more in balance. I don't know. I'd certainly like to try, I think, is my stance on that. But we might, of course, make it worse, as we so frequently do, but not always.
I guess that's the clincher for me, actually, for the pest control thing is the energy that we're bringing to the planet, and it's more of a continuation of the same mindset that we should try and control nature, that we should interfere, manipulate, and even be violent towards nature if it suits us. Where we think we need to have a new, different mindset based on living with nature and being one of the animals among many animals that live in nature. And, we're teaching our kids to go kill possums and all sorts of awful things. So what kind of society we're breeding by teaching these values to our kids, that's another big conversation.
It's barbaric, isn't it? Well, I'm aware that we're over time, and we barely scratched the surface of decolonialism, and we didn't get to other topics. So a conversation to be continued. Thank you both very much for talking to me. I very, very much enjoyed it.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harry.